The chandeliers at Ashworth House burned by the hundred, and not one of them was lit for Isolde Blaine. She stood where she always stood beside the marble pillar at the edge of the musicians' gallery. In the place where the light thinned and the eye moved past without catching. Her gown was her grandmother's, altered twice before it reached her and once more by her own hands last Tuesday evening. She had unpicked the lace from the cuffs and moved it to the neckline. Turned the sash inside out for the fresher side, added a narrow gold trim along the hem that caught the candlelight at the right angle. From 6 feet away. It looked like this season's. Isolde had learned early that no one at these assemblies came closer than 6 feet, her cousins did not stand at the edge. Cecily was in the center of the room in pale rose. Laughing at something a cavalry officer had said. Leonie stood half a step behind her in ivory, waiting to be laughed at next. Between them they occupied the warm, bright middle of the floor. And they had earned it the honest way by being pretty and by being seen. Isolde did not begrudge them the light. She only noted, in the precise and habitual way she noted everything. That the pillar was cold against her shoulder blades, she had been brought to carry things. That was understood. She would hold Cecily's fan and remember Leonie's dance card and murmur the right names when a partner needed reminding whose cousin this was. A useful relation. An unpaid attendant in an altered gown. She had made her peace with it the same way she had made her peace with most things, by finding what was useful in it. Carrying things meant moving through rooms unnoticed. Moving unnoticed meant she saw what other people did not bother to see. Tonight she saw the man at the far end of the room, that he sat alone, back straight, in a chair against the wall as she stood against hers. Dark-haired, perhaps 2 or 3 years past 30. With the kind of stillness that was not ease but discipline, the stillness of a man who had learned to give nothing away because everything he gave away had once been used against him. His eyes moved over the room in slow, steady passes. Not searching. Cataloguing. Wherever they landed. The nearest conversation dropped half a note, the Duke of Ashdale. 3 months returned to London after an absence of 3 years, and the whispers had arrived well before he did. He's kept the north wing locked for 15 years. A woman murmured somewhere behind Isolde's left shoulder. Both floors. Not even the housemaids are permitted in the corridors, they say the windows are sealed from the inside, her companion replied. In daylight, still dark, they say. A significant pause. The kind that costs nothing and implies everything. Well. A man doesn't seal his own house without a reason, does he? The not saying hung in the warm air like smoke. Isolde looked at the Duke of Ashdale and he, for one precise moment, looked back. It was nothing. A second. Perhaps less. But in that second she saw the thing the whole room had agreed not to see, that he was not cold. He was braced, that he sat the way a man sits when he has been still under scrutiny for so long that stillness has become the only defense he trusts, not because he felt nothing, but because he had learned that anything he showed would be taken, turned, and handed back to him as evidence. She knew that posture. She held it herself against the pillar every evening of the season. The difference was only that his chair was at the center of everyone's attention and hers was at the edge of no one's. Then Cecily was at her elbow. Breathless and bright and deliberate. There you are, Cecily said, as though Isolde had been hiding, as though the pillar were an indulgence. Leonie arrived on her other side, Fan already opened her signal that she intended to say something she found amusing. Leonie has a wager. Cecily said. A very small one, Leonie said. The length of ribbon from my fan. Blue. It's quite nice ribbon. Isolde waited. Go and ask him to dance. Cecily's chin tilted toward the far end of the room, toward the still man in the straight chair. Toward the 10 feet of empty floor that the rest of the assembly had left around him like a quarantine. Walk across the room, present yourself, and ask the great dreadful Duke of Ashdale for a set. No one in this room would do it for £100. You have nothing to lose. Isolde. That gown certainly won't find you a husband regardless. She smiled. Give us something to talk about. There it was, plain as a survey line. She was to be the entertainment. The plain cousin, the useful one. Dispatched across the floor to make herself ridiculous before the man everyone feared. So that 2 drawing rooms full of bored people could have a story to carry home. The monster and the wallflower. Well matched. Well served. Leonie was already glancing around to see who was watching. That was the point. Not the dare. The audience. Isolde looked once more at the man at the end of the room. She thought of him sitting there through 3 hours of whispers. Motionless under the weight of everything the room had decided about him without asking. She thought of the sealed windows and the locked corridors and 15 years of a house that had made itself dark in a particular wing for a reason no one had bothered to find out, she thought. A map with a blank space in it is not a complete map. It is a map that has decided not to know something. Give me the ribbon now. Isolde said. I won't have you claim afterward that I misunderstood the terms. Cecily's smile stalled. She had not expected to be taken literally. She unpicked the blue ribbon from her fan with 2 sharp tugs and placed it in Isolde's open hand. Isolde folded it carefully once. Twice and put it in the pocket of her grandmother's altered gown. Beside the small brass compass she always carried. Then she stepped away from the pillar. The floor between her and the Duke of Ashdale seemed very wide. She crossed it at the pace she used when surveying unfamiliar ground, neither hurried nor hesitant. The pace of someone who intended to arrive. She felt eyes catch on her as she went, one by one, the way a measuring line catches on uneven terrain. By the time she was halfway across, the nearest cluster of conversation had gone quiet to watch. She kept her chin level. Her mother had spent years trying to teach her to lower it. She had never learned. She reached the edge of that 10-foot radius of empty floor. She stepped across it. The Duke of Ashdale looked up close. His face was not hard. It was tired. There were fine lines at the corners of his grey-blue eyes that had nothing to do with laughter. And the set of his jaw was the set of a man who had been holding a particular expression for so long it had begun to feel like his actual face. He watched her cross the last of the distance with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read intentions quickly. Because the cost of misreading them had once been very high, Isolde stopped, and made her curtsy honest, neither too deep nor too shallow. The curtsy she gave to everyone regardless of rank, because she had decided years ago that calibrating her respect to other people's titles was a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford. Your Grace, she said. Good evening. I wonder if you would do me the honor of the next set. 1 second passed. 2. She watched him look past her shoulder once, briefly. Precisely toward the far end of the room where Cecily and Leonie stood with their heads together. She watched him understand the complete architecture of the situation, who she was, what she had been sent to do. And why the 2 women at the edge of the room were already leaning toward each other with bright, anticipatory eyes. She watched him decide. The Duke of Ashdale stood up. He rose to his full height without haste, and he did not simply offer his hand. He bowed to her a full, formal bow. The bow one gave to a duchess at a royal presentation, the bow that said I receive this as an honor, and he offered her his arm with the gravity of a man who had decided, in full view of everyone watching, that this moment would be conducted with complete and unambiguous courtesy. Miss Blaine, he said. His voice was low and even. The honor is mine. The room went very quiet, not the quiet of a conversation pausing. The quiet of an entire assembly recalibrating. Isolde was aware of it the way she was aware of the change in air pressure before rain, not as sound but as density. She placed her hand on his arm and they walked to the floor together, and she did not look back at her cousins. Because she had learned long ago that the moment you check whether someone is watching is the moment you give them the satisfaction of having mattered. They took their place in the set. The musicians began. He danced well, not showily, but with the precise, unhurried competence of a man who had been taught properly and saw no reason to perform beyond the requirements of the thing. He held the correct distance, moved through the figures without commentary, and watched her with the kind of attention that was not flattery but assessment, the look of someone deciding whether a thing was what it appeared to be. Isolde found it restful, which surprised her. You were sent as a joke, he said, when the figure brought them close enough for quiet speech. It was not a question that I was, she said, and you came anyway. Did I find that if something is going to be said of me, I would rather earn it than have it invented. She met his eyes. I was told you were dreadful. I thought I would come and assess the evidence myself. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The architecture of one. And your assessment that I haven't finished gathering evidence. Isolde said. But you bowed to me as though I were worth bowing to. That's more than the rest of the room has managed tonight. She paused. It's a point in your favor, your grace. That he looked at her, then really looked, the way she had not been looked at in a very long time. As though she were a document worth reading carefully and not a face to be glanced at and filed. The whispers around them had risen again. She could feel the room reassembling its narrative in real time. She had been sent as the joke, and she had become, somehow, the variable that didn't fit the equation. That he heard the whispers too, but he did not lower his voice to spare himself, and he did not shorten the dance to spare her. They will talk of you now, he said quietly. For this. I am sorry for it. They've talked of me my whole life for considerably less. Isolde said. At least this time I chose the subject, for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time, in a room full of people who had decided everything about him before he arrived. The Duke of Ashdale very nearly smiled. They danced the full set. He asked her 2 questions and listened to both answers with the focused attention of someone accustomed to information matching. He told her almost nothing of himself, not evasively, but with the careful economy of a man who had learned that what he offered was often used in ways he hadn't intended. When the music ended and she prepared to return to her pillar, he did not simply release her hand. That he bowed again. The same bow. The full formal bow. In front of the same room that had watched her cross the floor as a joke, that had expected her to be turned away or ignored or suffered in stiff silence. The same room that was now, she could feel it, composing a very different story. Thank you for the dance, Miss Blaine. He said. It was more than I expected this evening to contain. Isolde walked back across the floor. She found Cecily and Leonie where she had left them. Their faces wearing the particular expression of people whose plan has produced an unexpected result and haven't yet decided whether to be pleased or annoyed. She reached into her pocket, drew out the blue ribbon, and placed it in Cecily's hand without a word. She did not explain what had passed between them. It was not theirs to have. The supper room at Ashworth House was quieter than the ballroom, and Isolde was not supposed to be in it. She had followed Cecily in to carry the shawl, which was her usual function at the supper interval. And Cecily had been immediately absorbed into a cluster of young women near the window who had a great deal to say to one another and no use for a cousin holding fabric. Isolde had set the shawl over the back of a chair where Cecily would find it and positioned herself near the cold buffet with a glass of lemonade she did not particularly want, because a woman with a glass looked purposeful and a woman without one looked lost. And she had learned the difference mattered. The Duke of Ashdale was also not supposed to be in the supper room. She became aware of him the way she became aware of most things, not by looking directly but by noticing the change in the room around him. A small clearing in the conversation. A sly T-adjustment in the angle of nearby shoulders. He moved through it without acknowledgement, collected a glass of something from the far end of the table, and came to stand at the window 3 feet from where she was standing. That he did not appear to have planned it. Neither had she. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside the window, carriages moved in the street below, their lamps making small warm circles in the dark. You are a cartographer, he said. Not a question. He had remembered. A surveyor and mapmaker, Isolde said. The distinction matters to people who commission the work. A cartographer makes maps from other maps. A surveyor goes and measures the ground herself. And is there much ground requiring measurement in London in the season? Less than you'd think. Most of my commissions come from estate owners who need their land properly recorded, boundaries, drainage, rights of way. The kind of work that prevents disputes. She turned her glass in her hands. People are generally more willing to hire someone they consider beneath them for work they consider beneath them. It suits me. He was quiet for a moment. In the way she had already begun to recognize not the silence of someone waiting for his turn to speak, but the silence of someone actually thinking about what had been said. You find it useful, he said. Being underestimated that I find it accurate. Isolde said. I am underestimated. I have simply decided to treat it as information rather than injury. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. Recognition that MY Estates maps were lost, he said. 3 years ago. There was a fire in the East Records room contained quickly. But the survey documents were stored there. The whole property. 40 years of recorded boundary work. Isolde looked at him. Without current survey records, any boundary dispute would be decided on historical testimony. That's an uncomfortable position for a large estate. Yes, the Ashdale holding is substantial. North Yorkshire, primarily. With parcels in 2 other counties if I remember the directories correctly. He looked at her with the particular attention of someone recalibrating. You read the land directories? I read everything that has maps in it. Isolde said. It's an occupational habit. She paused. A complete resurvey of an estate that size would take the better part of a season. Longer if there are complications. There are complications, he said. The words sat between them with a specific gravity she didn't press on. A map, she had learned, told you where the edges of things were. It did not tell you what had made them that way. A blank space on a map, she said, is not a secret. It's an error. The ground is still there whether you record it or not. The map is simply lying about what it knows. He was still for a moment. Then. And if the blank space is deliberate, then the map is still lying, Isolde said. It has simply decided to lie on purpose. He looked at her steadily. Outside, a carriage lamp swung past the window and the light moved briefly across his face. And she saw in it something she had not expected to see in a room full of supper guests, the look of a man who had not had a conversation like this in a long time and was not entirely certain what to do with the fact that he was having one now. My Stewart has the names of 3 surveyors he has wore. Ked with previously, he said. I will tell him to add yours. I work under my own name, Isolde said. Blaine Survey and Cartographic. Some estate managers object. Mine will not, the Duke of Ashdale said. With a finality that closed the subject entirely, they stood in silence for another moment, a different silence than the first one, easier. The silence of 2 people who have finished saying a thing and don't feel the need to fill the space after it. Then Cecily appeared at the doorway with the expression of someone who had realized her shawl was unattended, and Isolde set down her glass and went to retrieve it. And did not look back, but she thought, crossing the supper room with the silk shawl over her arm, of a blank space on a map. Of the deliberate kind. Of 40 years of survey records that had burned, and a large estate in the north of England that had not been properly recorded in 3 years. And a man who had said there are complications in a tone that meant something else entirely. A map with a blank space was not a complete map. She had never been able to leave an incomplete map alone. The blue ribbon sat on Isolde's dressing table when she came home. Because she had taken it from her pocket and put it there, and she looked at it for a moment before she sat down, she had won the wager. That was the fact of it. She had crossed the floor, she had asked, she had danced the full set. And she had returned with the ribbon as evidence. Cecily had taken it from her hand in the entrance hall with an expression that was trying very hard to be amused and not quite managing it, and Leonie had said, in a tone pitched carefully between admiration and something else, well. You are odd. Isolde. I've always said so, Isolde had not replied, because there was nothing useful to say and she had long since stopped trying to say it. She sat down at her small desk and opened the survey ledger where she kept her commission notes. Under the date she wrote, Ashdale Estate. North Yorkshire. Complete resurvey. Fire damage to existing records, 3 years unrecorded. Complications unspecified. Await Stewart contact. She looked at what she had written, then she wrote underneath it, smaller. North Wing. 15 years. Sealed. She did not know why she wrote it. It was not survey information. It was not relevant to boundary measurement or rights of way. It was the kind of note a surveyor did not put in a professional ledger. She left it there anyway. And closed the book. The commission arrived 4 days later. Not from the steward, from the Duke of Ashdale directly, in his own hand, on paper with his crest pressed into the wax. The terms were clear and generous: full access to the southern, eastern, and western portions of the estate. Use of the estate's horses and equipment, lodging in the guest wing for the duration of the survey, a fee that was more than she had earned in the previous 6 months combined. There was one additional clause, written in the same even hand as the rest. The northern portion of the property is not included in the present commission and will not require survey at this time. Isolde read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it in the ledger beside her notes, and went to tell her aunt's household that she would be leaving for Yorkshire at the end of the week. She found her cousins in the morning room. Cecily was reading a letter of her own. Leonie was embroidering something she would never finish. "That I have a commission," Isolde said. "I'll be in Yorkshire for the season. Possibly longer." Leonie looked up. "Whose estate?" Isolde told them. The silence that followed was a different quality than the usual silences in that room. Cecily set down her letter very carefully. "The Duke of Ashdale," she said. "The resurvey is overdue," Isolde said. "The records burned." Another silence. She could see Cecily recalculating the wager, the dance, the bow, the supper-room conversation that 3 separate people had apparently reported to 3 separate people who had reported it onward. Because that was what supper-room conversations did. She could see Leonie looking at her with the expression of someone who had spent a long time being certain of a particular fact and has just been given reason to doubt it. "Well," Cecily said finally, in a tone that had decided to be gracious about something it hadn't chosen. "Yorkshire in April isn't entirely dreadful, I suppose." Isolde picked up her compass from the side table where she had set it, dropped it in her pocket, and went to pack. Ashdale Park stood on the north side of a shallow valley, and from the road it looked like every other great house in the north of England: pale stone, symmetrical windows, a long approach through parkland that had been designed to make the house seem inevitable, the natural conclusion of all that careful landscape. The kind of house that had always been there and intended to go on being there indefinitely. Isolde had surveyed enough estates to know that the outside of a house told you almost nothing useful. What mattered was the interior geometry: how the spaces related to one another, which doors opened onto which corridors, where the load-bearing walls ran and where the later additions had been grafted on. A house's history was written in its floor plan if you knew how to read it. She read this one from the carriage window as they came up the approach: south wing, oldest. The stone a slightly different color from the rest. East wing added later, the roofline not quite matching. West wing more recent still, the proportions more regular, the windows larger. And the north. She leaned forward slightly as the carriage rounded the final curve. The north wing was the same age as the south, which meant it was original. Which meant whatever had happened there had happened to the oldest part of the house. The windows on the north face were shuttered, every one of them, from ground floor to attic, the wooden panels pulled closed and, from the look of the weathering, not opened in a long time. In daylight. Still dark. The butler who met her at the door was a spare, careful man named Preston, who had clearly been told to expect her and clearly was not certain what category to put her in. He showed her to the working room that had been prepared: a south-facing room with good light, a large table, and 3 chairs, one of which had been fitted with a slanted board for drafting. "His Grace has arranged for the estate horses to be available to you each morning from 7, Preston said, in the tone of someone reciting terms he had memorized. "The grooms will assist with equipment. The housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, can provide access to any of the domestic records you require: drainage maps, the old field surveys that survived the fire, correspondence regarding the boundary disputes in 1809. Thank you," Isolde said. "And the north wing." A pause. Brief, but she had learned to measure pauses. "The north wing is not included in the present commission, miss. I understand that. I'm asking about access to the corridor that runs along the outside of it, the covered walkway connecting the east and west sections. I'll need to pass through it to measure the courtyard accurately." Preston considered this with the expression of a man navigating between 2 clear instructions that had not anticipated one another. "I will ask His Grace," he said finally. Of course. He left her to it. Isolde stood in the center of her new working room and looked at the large blank paper she had unrolled on the drafting table. She had brought 6 rolls of her best survey paper, 3 sets of measuring chains, her transit instrument, a full set of drafting tools, and the small brass compass that had been her mother's, the one she had carried every day for 11 years. Since the morning after her mother's funeral, when she had found it in the pocket of her mother's coat and put it in her own, she set the compass on the top right corner of the blank paper. The way she always did when she was starting a new survey. A habit. A beginning. Then she picked up her pen and, in the bottom left corner where the legend would eventually go, wrote 2 words, Ashdale Park. She looked at them for a moment. Then she moved to the top right corner of the paper, as far from the legend as possible, and wrote 2 more words, very small, North Wing, below them, smaller still, not in present commission. She did not write pending. She did not write TBD. She wrote what she knew to be true, which was that the space existed and that she did not yet have permission to record it. The blank space sat at the top of the paper like a question she had promised not to ask yet. The house had a particular quality of quiet that Isolde noticed on her first evening and could not quite name until her 3rd day, when she finally understood what it was. It was not the quiet of an empty house. It was the quiet of a house where everyone had learned to move carefully, the footsteps of the maids, the closing of doors, the way conversation in the servants' hall seemed to happen at half the volume it would have elsewhere. Not from unhappiness, she thought. From long practice. The way a household learned to be quiet around someone who needed quiet. The way you learned to walk softly in a room where someone was sleeping, except no one was sleeping. The house was simply braced, the same way its master was, against something she had not yet identified. She was thinking about this on the 4th evening when Preston knocked at her working room door and informed her that Mr. Eldon would like to know if she required anything before the household retired. Tell him I would be grateful for 10 minutes of his time, if he can spare it, Isolde said. I have some questions about the old boundary records d'Amar. Eldon arrived 15 minutes later. He was older than she had expected, 70 or near it, with hands that moved slowly and eyes that moved quickly. The combination of a man whose body had slowed but whose attention had not. He had been at Ashdale since before the current Duke was born, Preston had told her. Which meant he had been here for whatever had happened and had chosen to stay. She had learned to pay attention to people who chose to stay. You'll be wanting the 1809 papers, he said, settling into the chair across from her drafting table. The boundary dispute with the Kerwick estate. There's a box of correspondence and 3 partial surveys. They weren't stored in the East Records room, fortunately, so they survived. I'd be grateful for them, Isolde said. But that's not quite what I wanted to ask about. Eldon looked at her with the careful attention of someone who had decided to listen before deciding whether to answer. The house, Isolde said. I've been trying to understand the layout. The north wing is the same age as the south, both original. But the connecting corridors between the wings were added later. That's unusual. Normally you'd build the connections first and the wings after. The house was built in pieces, Eldon said. The south wing first, then the north wing when the second son was born and the family needed more room. The corridors came 20 years after that. The second son, Isolde said carefully, the old Duke's brother, died young. Eldon's tone was even. The tone of someone reciting history they had made their peace with. Before the present Duke was born. Isolde nodded and said nothing, and let the silence ask the next question for her. She had found, over years of surveying, that silence was often more effective than a direct question. People filled silence with what they actually thought, rather than what they had prepared to say. Eldon looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, the north wing was closed the year before the present Duke came back from his time abroad. About 15 years ago now. He closed it himself. Gave the order one morning and that was that. We didn't ask. A pause. He's not a man you ask that. Is he not? Isolde said. He's a fair man, Eldon said, with a sharpness that surprised her, the sharpness of someone correcting a misapprehension before it could take hold. I want to be clear about that. Whatever they say in London, and I know what they say. We're not so far north that it doesn't reach us. It isn't what I know. He's the fairest master I've served in 50 years. He doesn't ask more than a man can do, and he doesn't forget what he owes. His voice dropped slightly. He's not cold. He's carrying something. Those are different things, yes. Isolde said. They are. Eldon looked at her with a new quality of attention, as though she had passed a test she hadn't known she was sitting. The old surveys, he said. Rising. He'll have them brought to you in the morning. There's also a set of the original architect's drawings from when the north wing was built, floor plans, elevations. They're in the household archive, not the estate records. So they weren't in the east room when it burned. He paused at the door. They'd give you the dimensions of the wing, if you needed them. For the surrounding measurements, Isolde looked up. I'd be very glad of them, she said, after he had gone. She sat for a moment at her drafting table and looked at the blank paper with its two small words in the corner. North wing. The architect's drawings would give her the floor plan. They would give her the external dimensions. They would tell her exactly how large the space was that she was not suppo. Said to measure. A map with a blank space was not a complete map. She picked up her pen and added a single small mark beside the two words, not a letter, not a number. The mark she used on working surveys to indicate, data exists, not yet incorporated. Then she set down the pen and went to bed. And lay in the dark listening to the North Yorkshire wind work its way around the sealed shutters of the wing on the other side of the courtyard, and thought about a man who was carrying something, and the difference between cold and braced. And the particular kind of quiet that a house learned when it had been holding its breath for 15 years, she had been at Ashdale 10 days before she saw the Duke. This was not accidental. Preston had arranged things with quiet efficiency so that her working hours and the Duke's movements occupational, i.e. different parts of the house at different times, she in the south and east wings in the mornings, he in the library and estate offices, she in the west fields in the afternoons, he receiving his steward and land agent. It had the quality of a timetable. Carefully constructed, Isolde had worked within it without comment. Because she understood its purpose. A man who had spent 3 years rebuilding his tolerance for London did not necessarily wish to encounter a stranger in his own corridors every morning. She respected that. She had her survey to complete, and she was completing it with the thoroughness she brought to all her work, measuring every room and corridor and outbuilding of the permitted 3 wings, checking her numbers twice, noting every anomaly in the wall thickness where a later addition met the original stone. She was in the south long gallery on the 11th morning. Measuring the window embrasures. When she became aware that she was no longer alone, she did not turn immediately. She recorded the measurement. She was holding 4 feet, 3 inches, the same as the previous 6, and noted it in her field book, and then straightened and turned. Because to stop in the middle of a measurement was to lose accuracy, and she was not willing to lose accuracy for anything, including a Duke that he was standing at the far end of the gallery, perhaps 40 feet away, that he had not announced himself. He was not, as far as she could tell, doing anything in particular, not heading toward a specific door, not carrying anything, not in the posture of a man with a destination. He was simply standing at the end of the gallery looking at her the way she had seen him look at the assembly room, with that careful, cataloguing attention that gave nothing away. "Good morning, Your Grace," Isolde said. "Miss Blaine." He came a few steps closer, then stopped. Not at 6 feet closer than that. 8, perhaps. Close enough for conversation. Far enough for retreat. "I had not realized you had reached the long gallery. The south face is nearly complete," she said. 3 more window embrasures and the chimney breast. "And they'll move to the eastern corridor." She paused. "I hope I haven't disrupted your morning. No. He looked at the measuring chain she had laid along the floor. "How do you record the windows?" It was a genuine question, not polite conversation. Not the kind of remark people made when they felt they ought to say something. She had learned to distinguish the width and depth of the embrasure, height from floor to sill and from sill to lintel. Any variation in the stonework that suggests later alteration. She held up her field book. "Everything goes in here first, then I transfer it to the draft at the end of the day. The field book is the primary record. The draft is the interpretation, He repeated that a survey document is not just a record of measurements. It's a set of decisions about what the measurements mean. Where the boundary of a thing is. What counts as part of it. She looked at him. That's why a surveyor has to go and look. Rather than working from existing maps. The existing maps record what someone decided the last time. The survey records what is actually there. He was quiet for a moment. He had moved, she noticed, without appearing to have moved. So that he was now standing beside the nearest window embrasure rather than in the middle of the gallery. Closer to her. Perhaps 5 feet. She continued noting in her field book that if you found a discrepancy. He said. Between what the previous maps showed and what your measurements showed. What would you do? Isolde wrote down a number without looking up. Record the discrepancy. Note both measurements. Indicate which was verified and how. She turned the page. I wouldn't resolve it by choosing the old map over my own numbers. The point of going to look is to find out what's actually there, she heard him. Exhale, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it. When she looked up, he was looking at the window, not at her, and the expression on his face was the expression she had seen briefly at the assembly before the social mask came back down, not the tired, braced look, but something underneath it. Something that might have been, in another life, simply a man finding something unexpectedly interesting. On a map, he said, still looking at the window, how would you mark a door that was locked? That I'd mark it as a door. Isolde said. Lock it myself if you choose. The map records that a door exists. It doesn't record whether you've chosen to open it. A silence, and on the other side of the door. He said. If you didn't know what was there. I'd mark it as unverified. She set down her pencil. I wouldn't invent a room to fill the space, and I wouldn't pretend the space wasn't there. I'd mark the boundary of what I know. And leave an honest indication that something exists beyond it. She met his eyes. A good map is honest about what it doesn't know. That's different from a map that lies. He looked at her then with the full attention, not the cataloging sweep but the direct, focused look she had first seen when she had crossed the floor at Ashworth House, the look that meant he was reading something carefully because he thought it might be important. At the far end of the gallery, a footman appeared briefly in the doorway, saw them, and disappeared again. Through the window, she could see Eldon crossing the stable yard below with 2 younger men, and she saw him glance up at the gallery window, a brief upward look and then away. He had seen them. He was choosing not to interrupt the east corridor. The Duke said finally. The covered walkway between the east and west sections. You said you needed it for the courtyard measurements. I do. The courtyard can't be accurately measured without it. Preston will give you access tomorrow morning. Thank you. He nodded. He turned to go. Then he stopped. Not as though he had forgotten something, but as though he had decided something and said, without turning back, the north wing is 240 feet long on the exterior face. 17 rooms, 2 floors. And an attic. The windows are 12 panes each. A pause. In case it's useful. For the surrounding measurements he left, Isolde stood in the south long gallery for a moment without writing anything down. Then she opened her field book to a fresh page and wrote, very carefully. In the precise notation she used for verified data, north wing exterior, 240 feet 17 rooms, 2 floors, attic. Windows, 12 panes. Below it, she wrote, source, His Grace the Duke of Ashdale, verbal. 14 April, she marked it with the notation she used for information given voluntarily without request. In 11 years of surveying, she had never had to use it for a duke. The discrepancy appeared on a Wednesday. She had been measuring the east courtyard, a large flagstone space enclosed on 3 sides by the house and on the 4th by the old carriage house, and she had been doing it with the care she brought to enclosed spaces. Because enclosed spaces accumulated small errors that compounded in ways open ground did not. She measured each side 3 times. She measured the diagonals. She pasted and checked the pacing against the chain measurement, and then she transferred the numbers to her draft. And the draft did not balance. the east and west sides of the courtyard matched her measurements of the east and west corridors. The south side matched the south wing rear face. But the north side, the exterior face of the north wing, was shorter than it should have been by 11 feet and 7 inches. Isolde looked at the discrepancy for a long time. 11 feet and 7 inches was not a rounding error. It was not accumulated instrument drift. It was not a mistake in the chain length. She had checked all of those things. 11 feet and 7 inches was a real gap. Which meant there was 11 feet and 7 inches of courtyard that was not against the wall it should have been against. She went back to the courtyard with her chain. She measured the north wall of the courtyard, the wall that formed the exterior base of the north wing, 4 times. From 4 different starting points. The numbers agreed with each other exactly. She measured the wing itself from the outside, walking around the entire perimeter of the house to reach it. Measuring the north face from the east corner to the west corner, and there it was. The exterior north face was 14 feet longer than the courtyard wall that should have corresponded to it, not 11 feet 7. 14 feet. The difference between the two discrepancies was 2 feet 5 inches. The width of a standard interior corridor. She stood at the northwest corner of the house with her chain in her hands and worked it out. The north wing was 14 feet longer than the courtyard wall. The courtyard wall was 11 feet 7 inches shorter than her east-west measurements predicted. The difference was 2 feet 5. Which meant there was a space approximately 14 feet long, accessible from inside the north wing, not visible from the courtyard, that her measurements had found and her maps did not show. A room. Or a passage. Or a door. Opening not onto the courtyard but onto something else, something on the other side of the north wing's exterior wall, outside the enclosed courtyard altogether. She walked the length of the north wing's exterior face. Along the narrow service path that ran between the house wall and the estate's boundary plantings, and she counted her steps. At 42 steps from the east corner. The wall changed, not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone not looking for it would notice. The stone was the same pale Yorkshire limestone, the same coursing. But the mortar in the joints was different. Newer. Repointed, perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. By someone who had been careful about the color match but not quite careful enough, and at 50 steps, in the dense shadow of an overgrown yew hedge that had not been trimmed in years. Was an iron gate. The gate was not locked. It was held shut by the yew branches that had grown through and around it over what looked like a decade of neglect, the stems as thick as her wrist in places. The gate itself half buried in the growth. The iron had rusted to the color of old blood. Isolde put her field book in her coat pocket and her chain over her shoulder and took out the small pruning knife she carried for cutting back vegetation during outdoor surveys. She began to see it took 20 minutes. The yew was stubborn and the knife was not designed for this, and she scraped her knuckles twice on the rust and got a long pull in her sleeve on a sharp branch end. But the branches came away and the gate came free and she pushed it open. And the hinges complained in the way of hinges that had not moved in a very long time. On the other side was a garden. She stood in the gateway for a moment and simply looked. It was not the wilderness she might have expected from something closed for 15 years. It was not entirely tended. There the gravel paths had weeds pushing through, the planting beds had gone leggy and self-seeded. The roses had grown into large unshapely masses that had forgotten they were supposed to be disciplined. But the bones of the place were intact. The paths still ran in their original lines. The beds still held their shapes. The dry stone walls that divided the sections were solid. The slate-capped tops unbroken. Someone had built this to last, and it had lasted, in its own way, through 15 years of being left alone. The garden was perhaps half an acre, irregular in shape. Tucked into the space between the north wing's exterior wall and the boundary planting that hid it from the parkland. There was a central path, wider than the others, leading from the gate to a stone bench at the far end, and at the center of the garden, where the cross paths met. There had once been a planting of something large. She could see the outline of it in the bed, the place where the ground was slightly raised and the soil richer, where something substantial had grown for a long time and then been removed, or died, or both. She walked the central path slowly. The way she walked a new space, paying attention to everything. The planting beds had labels, small slate markers pushed into the ground at the head of each bed, the lettering worn but readable. Not Latin names. Common names, written in a hand she did not recognize, a careful, deliberate hand. Each letter formed with the precision of someone who was not used to writing outdoors. Sweet William. Lavender. Damask rose. And in one bed, smaller than the others, tucked against the north wing wall where it would get the most shelter, Forget-me-not. At the end of the central path. The stone bench had an inscription carved into its face. The carving was shallow, not a stonemason's work, but done by hand, by someone with a chisel and patience and, she thought, a great deal of time. She crouched in front of the bench and read it. A name. A woman's name, Eleanor, and below it a date, 16 years ago, and below the date, 3 words. She made this. Isolde stayed crouched in front of the bench for a long time. She thought about the sealed windows and the locked corridors. She thought about Eldon saying he closed it himself, gave the order one morning. That was that. She thought about 15 years of a house holding its breath around a space that had been, once, someone's garden. Someone named Eleanor, who had made it with her own hands and put her name on the bench at the end of the path. She thought about a man who had said some spaces are left blank on purpose, and about the difference between a secret and a grief. And about the way a map that pretended a space did not exist was not protecting anything, it was only ensuring that no one could find their way to it. She stood. Slowly, she took out her field book and her pencil and began to measure. She was still measuring when he found her. She heard the gate before she heard him, the iron hinges, still unhappy from her earlier persuasion, giving a second complaint as he pushed through. She did not stop measuring. She was in the middle of the northeast bed, chain stretched between 2 marker pins. And she held the line until she had the number and written it down. Then she straightened and turned. The Duke of Ashdale stood just inside the gate. He had come without a coat. She could see from the state of his sleeves that he had been in the estate office. The ones he wore for ledger work rather than receiving, and he had come quickly, which meant someone had told him. Preston, most likely. Or one of the gardeners who maintained the exterior plantings and would have seen the cut yew branches on the path. His face was doing the thing it did when it was very still, which she had learned meant it was working very hard. She waited. This, he said, is not the east courtyard. No. Isolde said. The east courtyard measurements are complete. This is the discrepancy I found in them. She held up her field book. Open to the page of numbers. The courtyard north wall is 11 feet 7 inches shorter than your north wing exterior. I followed the measurement. A silence. He looked at the field book without taking it. Then he looked at her, and then at the garden, the overgrown beds, the slate markers, the stone bench at the end of the path, and the stillness in his face became a different kind of stillness, the kind that was not discipline but something much older and much harder to hold. You had no right to come in here, he said. His voice was even. It was the evenness of tremendous effort. You're correct, Isolde said. I should have come to you with the discrepancy first and let you decide whether to show me what caused it. She did not look away from him. I didn't do that. I followed the numbers instead. I apologize for that, Your Grace. It was the wrong order. It was. He took a step into the garden. Then stopped, as though he had not entirely decided to do it yet. His eyes moved across the bed slowly, not cataloguing, something else entirely. Reading. The way someone reads a letter they have memorized but cannot stop returning to. I won't record anything I found here without your permission, Isolde said. If you want the discrepancy left as an unresolved note, I'll leave it as an unresolved note. Your name won't appear in connection with anything I can't verify. That is not. He stopped. Pressed his fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose. A gesture so unguarded she almost looked away from it. That is not what I'm concerned about. I know, she said quietly. He looked at her. The slate markers are still readable, she said. The walls are sound. The bench inscription. She stopped. Because she could see from his face that he knew what the bench inscription said, that he had put it there or watched it put there, and that she did not need to recite it to him. She made this, he said. Very quietly. Not to Isolde. The words went somewhere else entirely. Isolde said nothing. She had learned, over years of arriving in spaces that held other people's histories. That silence was the only honest response to a grief that had nothing to do with her. She folded her chain and put it in her coat pocket and waited, in the way she had learned to wait, without pressure, without implication, simply present. After a while he said, "She was my wife that I see." Isolde said, "She died." He said it plainly, the way you said a thing you had said so many times inside your own head that the words had worn smooth. 16 years ago. The year after she planted the last beds. She had been planning the garden for 3 years. She made drawings, dozens of them. Plant lists. Notes about what wanted more sun and what wanted the walls shelter. A pause. When she died I had the wing closed. I told myself it was temporary. That I would know when to open it again. He looked at the stone bench at the end of the path. I did not know. I kept not knowing. 15 years of not knowing. He was quiet for a moment. And now a surveyor has found my mathematics at fault and walked through my gate. Isolde looked at him. He was not asking for sympathy. He was not asking for anything. He was simply saying the shape of it. The way you said a shape aloud when you had been carrying it alone for so long that the weight had become difficult to distinguish from your own body. She was right to put her name on the bench. Isolde said. It is a very good garden. Even now. The bones of it are sound. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between startled and steadied. The discrepancy, he said, after a moment, ill-noted as resolved. Isolde said. Private garden, north wing exterior. Access via service path. Dimensions on file. She paused. No further description required unless you want it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a different tone, quieter, stripped of the careful governance she had come to recognize as his public voice. You said a map is honest about what it doesn't know. Yes, and if it knows something, and the owner of the ground asks it not to record the thing. Then the map notes that data exists and has not been incorporated at the owner's request, Isolde said. It doesn't pretend the space is empty. It says. There is something here. I have been asked not to say what. He looked at her for a long moment, standing in the overgrown garden his dead wife had made with her hands, and she looked back. And the 10 feet of careful distance that had governed all their previous conversations was simply not there anymore, and neither of them moved to reinstate it. Come back tomorrow, he said. He'll open the gate properly. He left the way he had come. She heard the hinges again. Then quiet. And the North Yorkshire wind through the untended roses, and the distant sound of the estate going about its business on the other side of the wall. Isolde stood in the garden for a while longer. Then she took out her field book and added one line under her measurements. Owner consulted. Further access to be confirmed. She marked it with the notation for, in progress. The architect's drawings arrived the following morning, as Eldon had promised, a roll of large sheets, the paper stiff with age and slightly foxed at the edges. Tied with a linen ribbon that had faded from blue to gray. Isolde unrolled them on her drafting table with the care she gave to any document that was irreplaceable. Weighting the corners with her compass and her inkwell and 2 smooth stones she had picked up from the courtyard, the drawings were beautiful. A proper architect, early last century, with a clean hand and an eye for proportion. Floor plans, elevations. Sections through the wall thickness. The north wing in its original form, before the connecting corridors. Before any of the later alterations, 17 rooms laid out with the logic of a house that had been designed to last. She spent the first hour simply studying them, then she moved to the second sheet, the ground floor plan. And began the careful work of correlating the architect's dimensions with her own measurements, looking for the places where the building as it existed had diverged from the building as it had been designed. These divergences were always interesting. They were the history of a place. Compressed into a few extra inches of wall or a doorway that had been moved 6 feet to the left. She was on her third correlation, a small discrepancy in the thickness of the partition wall between 2 of the north wing's ground floor rooms, when her pencil found the edge of something that was not W. She stopped, she ran the pencil tip back along the edge, gently. Not a fold in the paper. Not a stain. Something behind the top sheet, something in the same position as the partition wall. But not the same dimensions, the architect's drawings were double-layered. She had not noticed this before because the sheets were old and slightly warped from years of being rolled, and the edges had sealed themselves together with time and pressure. But the top sheet was not one sheet. It was two. The inner one folded very small and slipped between the larger drawings, then rolled up with them so small that it had been there, invisible. For however long the roll had sat in the household archive, she did not try to extract it herself. The paper was fragile and the edges were stuck in 3 places, and if she pulled at it incorrectly she would tear something that could not be untorn. She reached for her surveyor's knife, the fine tip. D1 she used for cutting paper rather than vegetation, and worked very slowly, easing the seal at each stuck point with the flat of the blade. Not rushing that it took half an hour, the inner document came free in one piece. That it was not an architectural drawing. It was a letter or something between a letter and a drawing, a single large sheet folded twice to fit the space. Covered on both sides in a handwriting she had not seen before. Not the architect's clean professional hand. A different hand, smaller, more deliberate. With the slight unevenness of someone who was writing with great care because the writing mattered and they were not certain how much strength they had left. The paper had a quality she recognized, with a chill that was not unpleasant but was not comfortable either. As the quality of paper that has been handled many times and then stored carefully, the creases at the folds had gone soft with repetition, the surface had the faint shine of paper that fingers had moved across again and again, as though someone had read and reread and refold, many times. Before finally placing it somewhere they believed it would be safe, the document was a plan, a hand-drawn plan of the garden. Not a professional survey, she could see that immediately, but the plan of someone who had measured carefully and drawn carefully. Who understood that a plan was a record and wanted this record to be accurate. Every bed was marked. Every path. The dimensions were written in at the edges in a small, precise hand, not quite professional but not far off. Plant names filled the beds. And beside each name a date when it had been planted, she understood, reading the pattern, and beside some of the dates, brief notes: not enough sun. Moved April. Doing well after first winter. Replace lost to frost, the notes of a gardener recording what she had learned. At the bottom of the plan, below the last measurement and the last note, was a single paragraph of text. The handwriting was the same. But the letters were slightly larger here, formed with more deliberation, as though the writer had wanted to be certain they were legible. This garden is for William. I have made it while I had the strength to make it. And I have written down everything I know about it so that when I am gone the knowledge does not go with me. The lavender wants cutting back in late summer or it grows woody. The damask roses on the east wall are old stock and will outlast anything. The forget-me-nots by the north wall will seed them. Selves every year without any help from anyone. They are the easiest thing in the garden and the most reliable, and I have always been unreasonably fond of them. I do not know when he will open the gate again. I only ask that when he does, he finds it as I meant it. A place that is still growing. A place that does not require him to be sad. I have tried to make it proof against neglect, because I know him, and I know that grief and duty will occupy him, and I do not want him to feel he has failed the garden by being human. If he finds this. I knew you would wait until you were ready. I always knew that about you. I was never afraid of it. Isolde set the plan down on the table. She sat very still for a long moment, with her hands flat on the drafting table on either side of the document. Not touching it. That I was never afraid of it. She thought about 15 years of sealed windows. About a man who had said I kept not knowing, and then 15 years of not knowing. About Eldon saying he's carrying something. That's different from cold. About the way the Duke of Ashdale had stood in the garden yesterday and said she made this in a voice that went somewhere else entirely. Eleanor had known. She had made the garden proof against neglect because she had known him well enough to know he would need it to survive without him. She had written down everything. She had folded the plan small and slipped it into the architectural drawings because she had known someone would eventually need to look at them, that the drawings were the kind of document that outlasted upheaval. That sat in archives undisturbed until the moment they were required. She had been waiting, in her way, for 15 years, for a pair of hands that would unroll the drawings carefully, that would notice the extra thickness, that would take the time to ease the seal without tearing. Isolde picked up her surveyor's knife and cleaned the blade on her sleeve. Then she folded the plan gently, back along its original creases, and wrapped it in a clean sheet of blank survey paper. And tied it with the same linen ribbon that had come off the architectural drawings. She did not take it to the Duke immediately. She sat with it for a while, the way she had learned to sit with important things before acting on them, giving herself time to be certain of what she was doing and why. Then she picked up the wrapped document and went to find him. She found him in the library. The door was ajar, not accidentally, she had learned. He left doors ajar when he was willing to be found, and closed them fully when he was not. She had noticed this on her second week at Ashdale without being told, the way she noticed the logic of a building's layout without being shown it. Some things could be read without a key. She knocked on the open door. "Come in," he said, and then, when he saw what she was carrying, the roll of blank survey paper, the linen ribbon, the particular way she was holding it, he stopped what he was doing entirely. She came in and closed the door behind her. Not latched, just closed. Because what she had to give him deserved a room of its own. "That I found this in the architectural drawings," she said. "In the north wing plans. It was folded inside them. Between the sheets. I don't believe anyone knew it was there." She set it on the desk in front of him. "I haven't shown it to anyone. I haven't discussed it with anyone. I wrapped it in clean paper so the original wouldn't be further damaged." She stepped back. "It's yours. I haven't read past the point where I understood what it was." This was not precisely true. She had read it once through, because she had needed to understand what she was holding. But she had read it as a surveyor reads a document, for its structure and its purpose, and she had stopped when she understood both. And she had not gone back. That he looked at the wrapped roll for a moment without touching it. "What is it?" "A plan of the garden," Isolde said. "In her hand. With notes." A pause. "And a letter. Of a kind that." He was very still. "The architectural drawings are double-layered in one section," she said. The inner sheet had sealed itself into the fold over time. "I used my survey knife to free it carefully, along the sealed edge. The paper is intact." She paused once more. "She put it there herself. I think. It's the kind of place that would only be found by someone working carefully with the drawings. Someone who would take the time to notice the extra thickness." That he put his hand on the wrapped document. Not opening it. Just resting his hand on it. "The way you rested a hand on something to confirm it was real. You should read it alone," Isolde said. "Ilgo.no." The word came out before he had finished deciding it, she thought. He steadied it. "No. Please stay." He stopped, and the careful governance in his voice was simply gone. Not eroded but absent. Like a coat that had been set down. "I find I don't want to be alone with it. If you're willing." Isolde sat down in the chair by the window. Not close. The chair where Eldon sat when he came with the estate accounts, the chair of someone present but not intrusive. He untied the linen ribbon. He led the blank survey paper with the care she had used to wrap it. And then he unfolded Eleanor's plan, and she watched his face as he read. She had watched people read important documents before: wills, survey findings, boundary agreements that changed the shape of what they owned. She had learned to read the reader rather than the document, because the reader's face was where the real information was. His face, unguarded now, was the most information she had ever seen in it. That he read the plant notes first. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, the small precise tracking of a man reading something dense with specific detail. And she saw something in his expression that was not grief but something adjacent to tenderness. The look of someone encountering a familiar voice in an unexpected place. He read the bed dimensions. He read the notes about the lavender and the damask roses. When he reached the final paragraph his face changed. It did not collapse. It did not perform. It simply changed. The way a landscape changes when the light moves across it, the underlying structure suddenly visible. She watched 3 years, no, 15, 16 move through it like weather. The specific weather of a grief that has been carried alone for so long that the carrier has forgotten it is weather and begun to think it is simply the permanent condition of the sky. That I was never afraid of it. That he read that line and went very still, and Isolde looked at the window. Because some moments were not hers to watch, she heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the kind that a man only allows himself when he has forgotten someone else is in the room, or has decided they can be trusted with it. After a while he said. She knew his voice was different. Not cracked, something further past cracking than that. On the other side of it, where the break had already happened and what was left was something quieter. She knew I would need a long time. He said. She knew before I knew. She planned the garden to survive without her attention because she knew I wouldn't be able to give it any. She wrote down everything so the knowledge would still exist even when she didn't. He looked at the plan in his hands. At the small careful handwriting filling the beds and the margins. I thought I was failing her. Every year the gate stayed closed. I thought she built something and I was letting it go to ruin. I thought she would have hated what I was doing. That he stopped. She says the forget-me-nots will seed themselves. Isolde said quietly. She says they're the most reliable thing in the garden and she was unreasonably fond of them. I saw them, they're still there. Along the north wall. Coming back every year exactly as she said they would. He looked up at her. She didn't build something that required you to tend it. Isolde said. She built something that would be there when you were ready. Those are different things. That he was quiet for a long moment. Outside the library window, the park lay in the late afternoon light, and the shadow of the north wing fell across the courtyard, and beyond it. Invisible from here but measurable, exactly 14 feet longer than the wall that was supposed to contain it, was Eleanor's garden. He folded the plan carefully back along its original creases, the way Isolde had folded it. The way Eleanor had folded it before them both. He did not put it back in the survey paper. He held it for a moment, and then he opened the desk drawer and placed it inside, gently. In the way of something being put somewhere it belongs rather than somewhere it is being hidden. He closed the drawer, then he stood, and went to the window, and pushed open the shutters that Isolde had never seen open before. And the evening light came in and fell across the desk and the floor and the empty chair where she had been sitting. She had stood when he stood. She was near the door now, giving him the room. Isolde, he said. She stopped. He had not used her given name before. Not in London. Not in any of the corridor conversations or the survey discussions or the supper room. He had said Miss Blaine with the precision of a man who understood what formality was for and when it was appropriate. He said her name now the way you said a word you had been holding in reserve. Waiting until you were certain it was the right moment. She turned. He was still at the window, one hand on the open shutter. The evening light behind him. His face was not the library face or the assembly face or the careful diplomatic face she had catalogued over the past weeks. It was simply his face, with nothing arranged over it. You found her, he said. In a fold of paper, in a roll of old drawings. In a room no one had opened in 15 years. You found her and you brought her to me without reading past the point you needed to, and you wrapped her carefully so she wouldn't be damaged. And you sat by the window and let me read. He paused. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it. Isolde said. That I know. He was quiet for a moment. That's not what I meant. He looked at her steadily. I meant that I have been thinking about what to do with it since the night at Ashworth House when you crossed a floor that no one else in the room would cross and asked me for a dance with the same composure you'd use to ask for the time. I have been thinking about it through 6 weeks of you measuring my house and talking to me about the honesty of maps and finding things that have been lost for 15 years. A pause. I am not practiced at this. I am aware that I am not practiced at this. But I am also aware that if I wait until I am practiced, I will have wasted whatever this is. Isolde looked at him at the tired, kind grey blue eyes, at the man who had bowed to her in a room full of people who had sent her as a joke. Who had given her the dimensions of his own sealed wing without being asked, who had stood in his wife's garden and said she made this in a voice that went somewhere she couldn't follow, and had said it anyway, there are conditions. She said, something moved at the corner of his mouth. Tell me, she told him in the garden that he had opened the gate himself properly, with the key he had found in the estate office after 20 minutes of looking, and the gate had opened without complaint this time. The rust persuaded by the key's authority in a way it had not been by her pruning knife. They walked the central path together, side by side, and she carried her field book out of habit though she did not open it, and he walked without his hands in his pockets for once. Without the careful governed posture, as though being in the garden made it possible to be slightly more like a person and slightly less like a duke, the forget-me-nots were along the north wall exactly where Eleanor's plan said they would be, a dense low sprawl of blue and white. Entirely unbothered by 15 years of being left to their own devices, first condition, Isolde said. Eldon stays. Whatever his age, whatever his pace. He stays in this house until he decides to leave it, in comfort, on his own terms, agreed without reservation. The Duke said. He has a room here as long as he wants one. That was already true, good. She looked at her field book without opening it, a habit of thought. Not of record. Second condition. This garden goes on the map. He was quiet for a moment. On the official survey, under whatever name you choose. It can be recorded as a private garden, designation at owner's discretion. But it exists, and it goes on the map. And it does not get recorded as a blank space or a discrepancy or an unresolved note. She looked at the stone bench at the end of the path, at the name carved into it. She made it. It should be on the record, yes, he said. Quietly. But without hesitation, third condition. She stopped walking and turned to face him, because the third one was the one that mattered most and she wanted to say it looking at him. In this house, your house. However it becomes, there is no one standing against a wall because the room has decided not to see them. If I see it happening, I will do something about it. I want you to know that before we agree to anything. Because it will occasionally be inconvenient. That he looked at her with the full attention. What will you do about it? Cross the floor, Isolde said. As many times as it takes. The almost smile arrived, and this time it did not stop at almost. It became the whole thing, not polished, not performed. The slightly lopsided and entirely unguarded smile of a man who has not had a reason to smile without calculation in a long time and has just been given one. Fourth condition, she said. Because she had said there were conditions and she intended to account for all of them, there's a fourth, call me Isolde. Not Miss Blaine. Not the surveyor. Not anything else. She held his gaze. I've spent my whole life being useful to people who didn't bother to learn my name. I would like, for once, to be somewhere that knows it. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw in his face the thing she had first seen across a London ballroom, not cold, not braced, but present in a way that most people were not, the look of someone who was actually there and knew the weight of it. Isolde. He said, just her name. Unhurried. The way you said a word you intended to keep. She took her mother's compass out of her pocket, the small brass one she had carried every day for 11 years, and held it for a moment in her palm. Then she opened her field book to a fresh page. And wrote at the top of it, Ashdale Park. Revised survey. Final draft, below it, in the space where the legend would go, Eleanor's garden. North wing exterior. Access, open. She looked at what she had written. Then she looked at him, fifth condition. She said that he waited, help me remeasure the garden properly. I have the dimensions from my first pass, but I went too quickly. I was working on anger and surprise, and I cut 2 corners on the eastern section that I know are wrong. She held up the field book. I want it to be accurate. She measured it. Carefully. The least I can do is measure it back. He looked at her for a moment, at the compass in her hand and the field book and the mud on her boots from the first time she had cut her way through the U, and the long pulled thread in her sleeve that she still hadn't repaired. And whatever it was in her face that she couldn't see from the inside. Where do you want to start? He said, "The northeast corner," Isolde said. Where I stopped, they went to the northeast corner of Eleanor's garden, and he held the end of the measuring chain, and she read the numbers. And the afternoon light came down through the gap in the yew hedge where the gate now stood open, and the forget-me-nots grew along the north wall as they had grown for 16 years, without any help from anyone, the most reliable thing in the garden. She recorded every measurement, the map. When she finished it, would be accurate. It would show exactly what was there, the beds and the paths and the walls and the bench with its inscription, and the gate in the southeast corner, and the gap in the yew where the light came through. It would show the north wing beside it. Its 17 rooms, its 12-pane windows, no longer sealed, that it would show the space exactly as it was, and in the legend, in the neat surveyor's hand she had been practicing since she was 14 years old, Ashdale Park. Surveyed and recorded by I. Blaine. April-May 1815. All measurements verified. She would put her name on it, the way Eleanor had put her name on the bench, the way you put your name on a thing you had made, so that the knowing did not go with you when you went.